Hey everyone, it's me Ishmael, and today we're going to be going over how to break down ABGs. Um, ABG being arterial blood gas. This is a common laboratory test that they'll use to evaluate the pH, the blood pH of patients when they're in the hospital. And this can be done in various specialties, such as in the emergency department or in the ICU or even med surge. Um, they'll do this all the time. Sometimes they can do this once, or depending on how critical the patient is, they can do this multiple times a day. And as a nurse, you're going to have to know how to be able to interpret these ABGs, because you'll be speaking with doctors about this a lot, and it'll just give you an overall picture of what's going on with your patient. So to start off, ABGs measure, you mainly want to worry about these three things here. Number one is pH, blood pH. It's a very narrow range. It needs to be between 7.35 or 7.45. It has to be within that narrow range. That's the homeostatic range. Next, you have carbon dioxide. It needs to be between 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. And after that, you have HCO3, which is bicarbonate. It has to be between 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. Those are the normal ranges for our ABGs. Now, some things to understand is that carbon dioxide is acidotic and bicarbonate is alkalotic. These two, when they're in this range, they always have to be in a bit of a balance. They have to balance each other out in order to maintain that homeostatic range of blood pH. If one is too low, that can bring the pH either up or down. If one is out of whack, it can just set the whole thing off, and oftentimes they're constantly working to compensate each other in order to maintain that homeostatic range. So just in general, when you're looking at these ABGs, just remember carbon dioxide is acidotic, bicarbonate is alkalotic. Okay? So next I want to discuss the Rome method for interpreting these ABGs. So Rome stands for respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. And I'll demonstrate what that means in just a second with our example here. So here we have this patient here, we draw an ABG on them, and this patient has a blood pH of 7.30, a carbon dioxide of 30, and a bicarbonate of 13. Okay, so the first thing you want to look at is the pH. 7.30. Is that within our normal range? No, it's not. This is low, so that means that our patient is suffering from acidosis. So right off the bat, boom, we have acidosis. The next step is determining whether it's a respiratory issue or a metabolic issue. So then you'll look at the carbon dioxide. It's 30. Is that within our normal range of 35 to 45? No, it's not. It's low. Okay, so then you look at the bicarbonate. It's 13. Is that within our normal range? No, it's not. It's low. So this is where Rome comes into play. Metabolic equal. Look at the metabolic, the bicarbonate. It's low. The pH is low. You see how they're equal? Low, low, that's equal. So boom, right there. That's our M and our E. That tells us that it's a metabolic issue. So you can say that this patient has metabolic acidosis. Based on these ABGs, you can determine that this patient is suffering from metabolic acidosis. Now, the next step is determining whether we're having compensation or not. Now, our bicarb is low. That's an issue. Our body recognizes this and is gonna typically try to compensate by altering its carbon dioxide level. So we look at our carbon dioxide level, it's low. That means that our body is trying to keep that carbon dioxide level low in an effort to raise the pH. So that tells us that, it's compensating. It's trying to work against that low bicarb by lowering that carbon dioxide. That is partial compensation. So you could say metabolic acidosis with partial compensation. And this is, I want to go over all of this right here that I have. There's 3 types of compensation you can have. Number 1 is full compensation, where you have a good pH and abnormal values. Number 2 is partial compensation, where you have a bad pH and abnormal values. And then no compensation is when you have a bad pH and only one normal value. The other is bad. That correlates to the bad pH. So in our case, we have partial compensation. So, our issue here with the pH is the bicarb. That low bicarb is causing that acidotic pH. But our body recognizes this and is trying to compensate by bringing that carbon dioxide level down, lowering that acidotic carbon dioxide. So it's trying to compensate, but it's not quite there yet because the pH is still low. So we call that partial compensation. And that just kind of gives you an idea as to whether this is kind of going a little more in depth, but generally if you have some compensation, that tells you that it's a chronic issue. If there's no compensation at all, it's very acute. Your body hasn't had time to get back and start compensating. And full compensation is also a chronic thing too. Like, for example, with COPD patients, they'll have a high level of carbon dioxide all the time, but they still function pretty well because their bicarb is raised. They have full compensation going on. So in order to drive all this home, I want to do another example real quick just to show you. All right. Okay, so we have another patient. We have another patient that we drew ABGs on. So let's take a look at these ABGs. We have a pH of 7.51. Is that low or is that high? It's high, right? It's above 7.45, it's high. So right off the bat, you have alkalosis going on. The next step is determining whether it's a respiratory issue or a metabolic issue. So then you look at the carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is 23. Is that low or is that high? It's low, right? It's 23, it's below 35, so it's low. You look at the bicarb, it's 22. Is that low or is that high? That's normal. That's within normal range. So really, our chief correlation here is the pH and the carbon dioxide. So that's where Rome comes into play. Respiratory opposite. You have a high pH and a low carbon dioxide. They're opposite of each other. Rome, so boom, that tells you it's a respiratory issue. So you could say this patient has, or let me write it in the other color. Respiratory alkalosis. Now, you want to see if they're compensating or not. Look at that bicarb. That bicarb is within normal range. It's not compensating. It's not trying to lower. If it were compensating, the body would try to excrete more bicarb and it would be lower, like 18. That would in turn bring that pH down. That would be compensation, but not in our case. This patient, their bicarb is normal, so you could say that there is no compensation going on. And I want you to visualize this a little bit into real world practice, what this all means. So in this patient is having respiratory failure. And I want you to visualize this. This patient, they're hyperventilating as a result of their respiratory failure. And the more you hyperventilate, the more carbon dioxide you're going to excrete. So because of this patient's hyperventilation, their carbon dioxide level got lowered. So their pH went up. So that hyperventilation that relates to that respiratory failure is causing respiratory alkalosis. And in the previous example, I didn't really talk about it, but in our previous example where we had metabolic acidosis, that patient was suffering from diabetic ketoacidosis. And that's an issue, that's a life-threatening issue that happens with diabetic patients where their body's producing too many ketones and it's leading to acidotic state in the blood. So those are just some real world examples you can think of where you might see, alkalosis or acidosis. Some other things to think about could be, respiratory failure or kidney failure. Just various issues can take place that can affect the blood pH. And that's all it is. It's pretty simple once you get the hang of the Rome method and know your normal ranges and just kind of have that understanding of the relationship between these two lab values and the pH. You should be good. You can be a pro at interpreting ABGs and you won't have no problems. You'll be a great nurse. And I hope this helped you, and I hope you have a great night. Thank you.